Why was the lantern still warm if the train had vanished 3 nights before? The question hung over the frostbitten fields of Bellflower, Missouri, like a shroud, whispered by farmers who dared not linger past dusk. The Ironwood Line, a modest railway threading through the Ozark Hills, had carried the 9:15 train from St. Louis to Joplin on that October night in 1879. It was a routine run, 20 passengers, a conductor, an engineer, and a fireman, all bound for destinations unremarkable. Yet by dawn, the train was gone. No wreckage, no tracks torn asunder, no bodies. Only a single lantern, its wick still smoldering, found upright on the rails where the train last passed. The air in Bellflower was heavy that autumn, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of the Ironwood Line, a railway built atop old Shawnee trails where the ground was said to hum with restless spirits. The elders recalled tales of the Wendigo's breath, a wind that carried voices not of this world, luring travelers into the dark. But no one had seen the train vanish. No one heard a scream. The only witness, a boy of 12 named Ezra Tuttle, swore he saw the train's headlamp flicker red before it melted into the fog. Ezra's account, scrawled in a trembling hand in his mother's journal, was dismissed as childish fancy. The light turned to blood, he wrote, and the train wailed like a beast. His mother, Abigail Tuttle, a widow who kept a small farm near the tracks, burned the journal page after the town preacher called it devilry. Yet she kept the lantern, hiding it in her cellar, its glass blackened as if kissed by soot. By the time the telegraph operator in St. Louis received word of the missing train, the wires buzzed with panic. A message, sent in haste, read, "Ironwood 9:15 lost. No trace. Lantern found. Send help." The search began at first light, October 12, 1879. Men from Bellflower and neighboring hamlets combed the tracks, their boots sinking into the mud. The railway stretched through dense woods where the oaks seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the sky. The searchers found nothing. No splintered wood, no twisted iron, no sign of the 20 souls aboard. Only the lantern, its warmth unnatural, its flame long extinguished but somehow alive to the touch. The men whispered of curses, of the land's hunger, but none spoke openly. Fear had a way of silencing truth. Abigail Tuttle, though, could not stay silent. She visited the town's sole telegraph office, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. "It ain't right," she told the operator, her voice brittle. "That lantern was my husband's. He worked the Ironwood Line till he died. It's been cold for years." The operator, a nervous man named Silas Reed, scribbled her words in his log but sent no reply to St. Louis. He too had heard the tales, the Shawnee curse, the lights in the woods, the shadows that moved without form. By nightfall, the search was abandoned. The men returned to their homes, their lanterns casting feeble glows against the encroaching dark. But the mystery gnawed at Bellflower like a wound. The preacher, Reverend Hollis, held a vigil at the church, his voice trembling as he spoke of God's will. "The Lord tests us," he said, "but the devil walks these hills." His congregation, sparse and shivering, clutched their Bibles, though some whispered of older gods, ones that demanded blood beneath the moon. Ezra Tuttle, forbidden from speaking of what he saw, stole away to the tracks that night. The boy knelt where the lantern had been found, his fingers tracing the cold iron of the rails. The air was still, but he swore he heard a hum, a low, mournful note, like a hymn sung by throats long dead. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell anyone. But in the days that followed, Ezra began to draw. Charcoal sketches filled his mother's almanac, a train wreathed in fog, a figure with no face standing at the edge of the woods, and eyes, always eyes, watching from the dark. The lantern, meanwhile, remained in Abigail's cellar. She could not bear to touch it, yet she could not cast it out. At night, she dreamed of her husband, his face pale as bone, his hands reaching from the earth. "It's still out there," he whispered in her dreams, though she could not say what it was. The townsfolk, too, began to dream of screams in the fog, of wheels grinding on unseen tracks, of a train that ran not on iron but on something older, something alive. By the third night, Bellflower was a town holding its breath. The telegraph wires fell silent, as if the world beyond had forgotten them. Silas Reed, alone in his office, swore he heard tapping on the line, irregular, frantic, like fingers clawing at a coffin lid. He transcribed the sounds, though they formed no words. Tap, 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 tap. He burned the paper before dawn, his hands trembling. No one would believe him. No one wanted to. The mystery of the Bellflower train killings was only beginning. The lantern, warm and waiting, was but the first thread in a tapestry of dread. The tracks stretched on, cutting through the hills like a scar, and somewhere in the dark, something listened. Something watched. Something hungered. What walks the tracks at midnight when the moon dares not show its face? In Bellflower, Missouri, on the fourth night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, the question crept into every hearth, unspoken but heavy as the fog that clung to the fields. The town, already bruised by fear, felt the weight of something older, something that stirred in the dark where the railway cut through the Ozark Hills. The lantern, still warm in Abigail Tuttle's cellar, had become a relic of dread, its glow a whispered accusation. No one dared touch it now, not even Abigail, who locked the cellar door and prayed the Lord's Prayer backward to keep the shadows at bay. The townsfolk avoided the tracks after dusk, but the stories grew. Old Man Carver, a trapper who lived at the edge of the woods, swore he saw lights moving where no train should be. "Not lanterns," he muttered to the men at the general store, his eyes roomy and wide. "Like fireflies, but red, dancing along the rails." The men laughed, uneasy, and turned away, but Carver's words took root. By evening, the store was empty, its windows shuttered against the night. A new clue emerged that day, found by a girl named Mercy Hale, who wandered too close to the tracks while gathering kindling. In a ditch, half buried in mud, lay a conductor's pocket watch, its face cracked, but its hands frozen at 9:17. The watch belonged to Thomas Greer, the conductor of the 915, a man known for his punctuality and his habit of humming hymns as he checked tickets. Mercy brought the watch to her father, a blacksmith, who took it to Reverend Hollis. The preacher held it as if it burned, his lips moving in silent prayer. "This is no natural thing," he said at last, his voice barely a whisper. "The devil keeps time in his own way." The watch was not returned to the railway company. Instead, it was locked in the church's iron box where the collection plate was kept. Reverend Hollis preached that night, his sermon a fevered warning of judgment. "The Lord sees all," he cried, "but the adversary walks among us." His congregation, smaller now, shifted uneasily. Some glanced at the windows where the dark pressed close, as if expecting to see eyes staring back. Others whispered of the Shawnee trails, of spirits that guarded the land and punished those who trespassed. The Ironwood line, they said, had been a blasphemy, its rails driven into sacred earth. Ezra Tuttle, meanwhile, grew stranger. The boy, once talkative, now spoke little, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the tracks disappeared into the woods. His mother found new sketches in her almanac, trains with windows like empty sockets, figures standing in fog with limbs too long for men. "Ezra, what do you see?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. The boy only stared, his lips forming words he did not speak. "It's still moving." Abigail burned the sketches, but the charcoal left stains on her fingers, black as the soot on the lantern's glass. The telegraph office, too, grew restless. Silas Reed, the operator, had not slept since the tapping began. The sounds came again that night, sharper now, like nails on glass. He transcribed them in his log, his hand shaking, tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. No message formed, But Silas felt watched, as if the wires carried not just sound, but intent. He sent a telegram to St. Louis, begging for a Pinkerton agent to investigate. The reply came at dawn, curt and final. No evidence of train, no funds for search. Cease inquiries. Silas tore the message to shreds, his breath fogging in the cold room. In the woods, the searchers had given up, but the land itself seemed to speak. Farmers reported their livestock fleeing the fields near the tracks, their eyes rolling white with terror. A hunter found a deer, gutted and strung across the rails, its blood black and viscous as if boiled. No one claimed the kill. No one spoke of it. But the children of Bellflower began to sing a rhyme, their voices high and eerie. Ironwood runs, but none come back. Wheels on fire, tracks all black. Their mothers hushed them, but the song spread, carried on the wind. Abigail Tuttle, sleepless and haunted, ventured to the church to speak with Reverend Hollis. She found him kneeling before the altar, the conductor's watch in his hands. "It ticks," he whispered, his face pale. "It shouldn't, but it does." Abigail backed away, her heart pounding. She did not ask to see the watch. She did not want to hear it. Instead, she returned home and nailed a cross above her cellar door, though she doubted it would hold. That night, a storm rolled over Bellflower, the sky bruised purple and split by lightning. In the flashes, some swore they saw the outline of a train, its cars swaying on invisible tracks. Ezra, awake in his attic room, pressed his face to the window. He saw nothing but rain, yet he felt it. The hum, deeper now, like a pulse beneath the earth. He scratched a new drawing into the floorboards. A hand reaching from the fog, its fingers tipped with claws. The town's fear grew teeth. Doors were bolted, windows boarded. The telegraph wires sang with static, though no messages came. The lantern in Abigail's cellar flickered, though no one had lit it. And somewhere, in the dark beyond the tracks, the red lights danced, as if beckoning. The Bellflower train. Killings were no longer a mystery of absence, but a presence, vast and unseen, waiting for the moment to claim its due. What grows in soil fed by screams, where the roots drink deep of forgotten blood? By the fifth night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's fields seemed to answer, their grasses curling inward, brittle and gray, as if scorched by an unseen flame. The town, nestled in the shadow of the Ozark Hills, felt the weight of a gaze that lingered too long, a presence that pressed against windows and whispered through cracks in the walls. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned brighter now, its light seeping through the floorboards, though no one dared touch it. The conductor's watch, locked in the church, ticked louder, a rhythm that matched no clock in Bellflower. The townsfolk clung to routine, but dread gnawed at their edges. Farmers found their crops wilting near the tracks, the soil there cold and slick, like the skin of something drowned. A widow named Eliza Crane, whose land bordered the railway, reported her well had turned foul, its water thick with a metallic tang. "It tastes of iron," she told the general store's keeper, her hands trembling as she clutched a pail. "Iron, and something alive." The keeper, a stooped man named Jonah, nodded but said nothing. He had seen the tracks at dawn, glittering with frost that refused to melt, even under the October sun. A new relic surfaced that day, found by a boy hunting rabbits in the woods. Tucked beneath a gnarled oak, half buried in leaves, was a torn page from a passenger's journal, its ink smudged but legible. The passenger, one Margaret Poole, had been a schoolteacher traveling to Joplin. Her words, written in a hurried hand, spoke of unease. The train sways as if on water. The windows show only fog, though the night was clear. A man in the next car hums a tune I cannot place, low and wrong, like a dirge for the damned. The page ended mid-sentence, the paper torn as if ripped from her hands. The boy, trembling, gave it to Reverend Hollis, who read it aloud at the evening service, his voice breaking on the final words. The congregation, thinner still, whispered of curses. The Shawnee trails, they said, were never meant to bear iron. The elders spoke of a story, half forgotten, of a medicine man who warned against cutting the earth. The land remembers, he had said, and it hungers. The tale was dismissed as heathen talk, but now it clung to the air like damp rot. Reverend Hollis burned the journal page after the service, but the smoke curled into shapes, wheels, faces, hands that made the children scream. Ezra Tuttle, silent and pale, no longer left the house. His mother found him carving into the walls, jagged lines that formed a train with too many cars, its windows filled with eyes. "They're still on it," he whispered when Abigail grabbed his hand. "They're still riding." She slapped him, her palm stinging, but the boy only stared, his eyes reflecting a light she could not see. That night she dreamed of the tracks, endless and twisting, leading to a place where the sky was ash and the ground pulsed like a heart. The telegraph office became a place of dread. Silas Reed, hollow-eyed, refused to enter after dusk. The tapping had grown relentless, no longer random, but rhythmic, like a code no one could crack. He wrote it down, page after page, tap, 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 tap. In the margins, he scrawled a single word, "Listen." No one did. The wires, he swore, carried voices now, faint, overlapping, like a crowd trapped in a well. He sent no more messages to St. Louis. The last reply had been a warning. Do not speak of the 9:15. Let it lie. In the woods, the red lights grew bolder. Hunters avoided the tracks, but some claimed to hear wheels grinding in the distance, though the rails lay empty. A trapper found a shoe, a woman's, its leather cracked and stained with something black. He left it where it lay, crossing himself as he fled. The children's rhyme grew darker, sung in secret. Ironwood calls, where shadows creep, wheels turn slow, in the dark they weep. Mothers lock their doors, but the song slipped through, carried on a wind that smelled of ash. Abigail Tuttle, desperate, sought out Old Man Carver, the trapper who spoke of the lights. He lived in a shack at the wood's edge, its walls hung with pelts and bones. "It's the land," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "It takes what it's owed." He showed her a charm, a Shawnee relic of twisted roots and feathers, said to ward off spirits. "Hang it high," he warned, "but it won't save you." Abigail took it, her fingers numb, and hung it above her door. That night the lantern's light pulsed, casting shadows that moved like figures in a dance. The storm from the previous night lingered, its clouds low and heavy, blotting out the stars. In the flashes of lightning, some swore they saw the train again, its outline faint, its cars stretched long and wrong. Reverend Hollis, sleepless, knelt by the church's iron box, the watch ticking in his hands. "Who are you?" he whispered, though he knew no one would answer. The ticking grew louder, a heartbeat in the dark. Bellflower was unraveling. The fields withered, the wells soured, the air grew thick with a hum no one could name. The lantern burned, the watch ticked, and the red lights danced along the tracks, closer now, as if the train, or what it had become, was coming home. Who carves the names of the lost into the bark of dying trees, where no hand should linger? On the 6th night after the Ironwood 9:15 vanished, Bellflower woke to find the oaks along the tracks scarred with letters, names of the passengers, etched deep as if by claws. The discovery sent a shiver through the town already brittle with fear, its people huddling in homes where candlelight flickered against the weight of the dark. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar glowed without flame, its light seeping through the cracks like blood through a bandage. The conductor's watch, locked in the church, now ticked backward, its hands defying time itself. The names on the trees, Thomas Greer, Margaret Poole, others known and unknown, were found by Jonah, the storekeeper, who had ventured to the tracks at dawn to retrieve a lost hammer. The letters were uneven, jagged, as if written in haste or rage. "It ain't human work," he whispered to the men gathered at the store, his hands stained with sap that smelled of decay. No one dared touch the trees, though some swore they heard a low moan when the wind passed through their branches. By noon, the townsfolk had a new name for the railway: the Devil's Spine. A telegram arrived that morning, the first in days, its words clipped and strange. Ironwood line closed. No further inquiries. Burn all records. Silas Reed, the telegraph operator, read it aloud to Reverend Hollis, his voice trembling. The preacher's eyes narrowed. "This is no earthly command," he said, crumpling the paper. He did not burn it, though he hid it beneath the church's altar, where the watch's ticking echoed like a pulse. Silas, sleepless and gaunt, refused to return to his post. The tapping on the wires had become voices, he said, whispers that called his name. The town's children, once bold with their rhymes, grew quiet. Their song, "Ironwood Calls Where Shadows Creep," was no longer sung, though some hummed it in their sleep, their voices discordant, as if joined by others. Ezra Tuttle, confined to his attic room, scratched new drawings into the floor. Trees with faces, their mouths open in silent screams, and a train with cars that twisted like a snake. Abigail found him staring at the wall, his fingers black with charcoal. "They're writing back," he whispered. She did not ask what he meant. She feared the answer. A new relic emerged that day, found by Eliza Crane near her fouled well. It was a locket, silver and tarnished, its clasp broken. Inside was a daguerreotype of a young woman, her face blurred as if smudged by a thumb. Eliza swore it belonged to Margaret Poole, the schoolteacher, though no one could confirm it. The locket was cold to the touch, yet it left a burn on Eliza's palm, a faint mark like a crescent moon. She gave it to Reverend Hollis, who locked it with the watch, muttering prayers that sounded more like pleas. The fields near the tracks grew stranger. Cornstalks bent toward the rails, their husks split open to reveal kernels black as coal. Farmers whispered of a blight, but none dared harvest the crop. Old Man Carver, the trapper, claimed the soil itself was wrong. "It moves," he told Abigail, his eyes wild, "like it's breathing." She clutched the Shawnee charm he had given her, its feathers frayed, and hung it higher above her door. That night, the lantern's light pulsed faster, casting shadows that swayed like figures in a waltz. Reverend Hollis held no service that evening. The church doors remained locked, though some claimed to hear him chanting inside, his voice rising and falling in a tongue no one knew. The congregation gathered in the square instead, their lanterns dim against the fog. A woman named Ruth, whose brother had been a passenger, spoke in a halting whisper. "I saw him, in the mist. His face was wrong." No one asked her to explain. They had seen things too, shapes in the fields, lights that flickered red and vanished. The woods beyond the tracks grew restless. Hunters reported tracks, not human, not animal, circling the scarred oaks. A boy claimed he saw a figure standing at the wood's edge, its head too large, its limbs too thin. "It watched me," he told his father, who beat him for lying. But the boy did not cry. He only pointed to the tracks, where the frost had thickened, forming patterns like veins across the iron. Abigail, desperate, visited Old Man Carver again. His shack reeked of smoke and blood, its walls now bare of pelts. "The land's awake," he said, carving a new charm from bone. "It took the train. It'll take more." He gave her the charm, its edges sharp, and told her to bury it at the track's edge. She did under moonlight, her hands trembling as the soil seemed to swallow the bone too eagerly. That night her dreams were of wheels, grinding not on rails but on bone, and a voice that sang her name. The storm lingered, its clouds a bruise across the sky. Lightning revealed glimpses of the impossible, a train silhouette, its cars stretched and warped, moving without sound. The telegraph wires hummed, though Silas swore the machine was unplugged. The names on the trees deepened, as if the bark bled ink. And in Bellflower, the air grew thick with a truth no one dared speak. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was waiting. Why do the shadows linger where no light should fall, stretching long and lean across the frost? On the 7th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's streets grew silent. The townsfolk shuddered in their homes as the dark pressed closer, its weight like a hand on the throat. The scarred oaks along the tracks wept sap, black and viscous, pooling at their roots as if the earth itself bled. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar now burned without oil, its glow a sickly yellow that pulsed in time with the ticking of the conductor's watch, locked away in the church. The locket, too, seemed alive, its burn mark spreading on Eliza Crane's palm, a map of veins no doctor could name. The town was a wound, festering under the gaze of something unseen. Farmers no longer ventured near the tracks, where the frost had thickened into ice that refused to crack under boot or axe. The air carried a hum, low and constant, felt more in the bones than the ears. Old Man Carver, the trapper, called it the land's heartbeat, though he spoke to no one now, his shack sealed tight, its windows boarded with planks carved with strange sigils. The children's rhyme was forgotten, replaced by a silence that screamed louder than words. A new discovery came at dawn, found by Jonah, the storekeeper, as he swept the frost from his porch. A scrap of cloth, torn and stained, lay in the dirt. A piece of a passenger's dress, its pattern faded but unmistakable. It belonged to Margaret Poole, the schoolteacher, whose journal page had been found days before. Jonah held it up to the light, his hands trembling, and saw threads unraveling of their own accord, as if the cloth sought to flee. He brought it to Reverend Hollis, who stood outside the church, his eyes hollow. "It's hers," the preacher said, though he had never seen Margaret wear it. "It's marked." The cloth was not burned. Reverend Hollis wrapped it in linen and placed it with the watch and locket, locking the iron box with a key he wore around his neck. His sermons had ceased, replaced by mutterings in a language that made the air feel heavy. "They're not gone," he told Abigail Tuttle when she came to plead for answers. "They're changed." His hands shook as he clutched the key, and Abigail saw shadows behind him, moving against the grain of the candlelight. Ezra Tuttle no longer spoke. The boy sat in his attic, carving into the walls with a knife he had stolen from the kitchen. His drawings were no longer trains but shapes, circles within circles, eyes within eyes, and hands that reached from nowhere. Abigail tried to take the knife, but Ezra's gaze stopped her, his eyes reflecting a light that was not her own. "They see me," he whispered, his voice not his own, deeper, like a chorus of the lost. She fled the attic, barring the door, though she heard him carving through the night. The telegraph office was abandoned. Silas Reed had vanished, leaving only his logbook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. "They call, they know my name. The wires sing." The tapping had stopped, replaced by a hum that rattled the windows of nearby homes. A farmer, desperate for news, broke into the office and found the telegraph machine unplugged, its wires coiled like snakes. He ran, telling no one, though his dreams that night were of hands pulling him into the dark. In the woods, the red lights grew brighter, no longer fleeting but steady, pulsing like beacons. Hunters swore they heard footsteps, heavy and uneven, circling the scarred oaks. A girl, fetching water from a stream, saw a figure in the fog, tall, its head bowed, its arms swaying like branches. She dropped her pail and ran, her screams waking the town. Her father found the pail later, its iron twisted into a spiral, as if crushed by a hand no man could wield. Abigail, sleepless and haunted, buried another of Carver's charms at the track's edge, her fingers sinking into soil that felt too soft, too warm. The Shawnee relic seemed to writhe as she covered it, and the ground hummed louder, a vibration that crawled up her spine. That night the lantern in her cellar flared, its light painting the walls with shapes, wheels, faces, fingers that stretched toward her. She nailed more crosses above her doors, but the wood splintered under her hammer, as if refusing her prayers. The storm, ever present, grew wilder, its winds carrying a scent of ash and iron. Lightning revealed the train's silhouette again, its cars longer now, their windows black as voids. Some swore they saw faces pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent cries. Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, knelt before the iron box, the watches ticking now a drumbeat. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The shadows answered with silence, but the locket burned through its linen wrap, its heat a warning. Bellflower was no longer a town but a cage, its people trapped by a fear they could not name. The fields withered completely. The wells ran dry and the air grew thick with a hum that spoke of hunger. The names on the trees bled sap, the cloth unraveled, and the red lights burned brighter, calling to those who dared listen. The Ironwood 915 was not lost, it was alive, and it was closer than ever. What whispers through the cracks of a house when the wind is still, speaking in voices that know your sins? On the 8th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's homes became tombs, their walls trembling with murmurs no one could trace. The air was thick with the scent of rust and rot, and the frost on the tracks had spread, creeping into the town like a tide. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned without wick or oil, its light now a sickly green, casting shadows that writhed like worms. The conductor's watch, locked in the church's iron box, no longer ticked but sang, a low, keening note that pierced the heart. The townsfolk barred their doors, but the whispers found them. Farmers woke to words scratched into their floors. "Come to the tracks." Widows heard their names called from empty rooms. Children, sleepless, stared at ceilings where shadows formed faces that were not there. The scarred oaks along the railway dripped black sap, their names, Thomas Greer, Margaret Poole, others, now smeared as if the trees wept ink. The locket, burning through its linen in the church, left scorch marks on the altar, a pattern like a handprint with too many fingers. A new relic surfaced that morning, found by a boy named Caleb, who had dared to fish in the stream near the tracks. Caught in the reeds was a Bible, its pages waterlogged and stained, its cover embossed with the initials T.G., Thomas Greer, the conductor. The text was unreadable, the ink running into shapes that looked like eyes, mouths, wheels. Caleb's hands blistered where he touched it, and he dropped it, running home. His mother, Ruth, took it to Reverend Hollis, who stared at it in silence. "This is no holy book," he said at last, his voice a rasp. "It's a door." The Bible was not burned. Reverend Hollis placed it in the iron box, though the lock groaned as if resisting. He no longer left the church, his face gaunt, his eyes reflecting a light no candle could cast. "They're calling," he told Jonah the storekeeper, who came to beg for guidance. "They want us to follow." Jonah fled, his dreams that night filled with tracks that led not to Joplin, but to a place where the sky was flame and the ground was flesh. Ezra Tuttle was lost to his carvings. The attic walls were a tapestry of horror, trains with teeth, figures with no faces, and a sky filled with hands. Abigail, desperate, tried to drag him downstairs, but he clawed at her, his nails drawing blood. "They're coming," he hissed, his voice layered, as if many spoke through him. She locked him in the attic, her sobs drowning out the hum that now shook the house. The lantern's light pulsed faster, its shadows forming a train that moved across the walls, its cars endless. The telegraph office, abandoned since Silas Reed's disappearance, was broken into by a farmer seeking answers. Inside, the air was heavy with static, the wires coiled and warm, as if alive. The logbook, left open, was filled with Silas's final words. "They're in the wires. They see me. They know." The farmer burned the book, but the flames turned green, and the smoke formed shapes that made him scream. He told no one, but the next day, his hair was white. In the woods, the red lights no longer flickered but burned, a chain of embers along the tracks. Hunters who ventured too close returned, changed, their eyes vacant, their speech halting. One spoke of a sound, a grinding like wheels on bone, that came from beneath the earth. Another saw a figure, its body twisted, standing where the train last passed. "It pointed," he whispered, "at me." The figure was gone when he blinked, but his hand bore a mark. a burn like the one on Eliza Crane's palm. Abigail, driven to madness, sought Old Man Carver once more. His shack was empty, its door ajar, its walls smeared with blood and sap. A single charm lay on the floor, carved from bone, its edges sharp enough to cut. A note scrawled in Carver's hand read, "The land takes. It always takes." Abigail clutched the charm, her blood mixing with the dirt, and buried it near the tracks. The ground swallowed it, and the hum grew louder, a chorus of voices that knew her name. The storm raged on, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette, now a writhing thing, its cars pulsing like a living beast. The whispers grew bolder, seeping into dreams. "Come to us. Join the ride." Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, opened the iron box. The watch sang, the locket burned, and the Bible's pages turned of their own accord, revealing words that were not scripture but names, endless names, written in blood. Bellflower was no longer a town, but a threshold. The fields were ash, the wells were poison, and the air was a scream. The red lights called, the tracks hummed, and the shadows stretched, reaching for those who listened. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was here, and it was hungry. What breathes beneath the frost? Where the earth pulses with a rhythm no heart should know. On the 9th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's soil seemed to stir, its surface cracked like skin too long stretched. The town, now a husk of its former self, cowered under a sky that bled gray, the stars swallowed by clouds that hung too low. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned with a light that was no longer light, a sickly pulse that painted the walls with shapes that screamed. The church's iron box holding the watch, locket, and Bible groaned as if alive, its contents humming a song that made Reverend Hollis's prayers falter. The whispers had grown into voices, sharp and insistent, seeping through the cracks of every home. They called names, recited sins, and promised passage on a train that no one could see but all could feel. The scarred oaks along the tracks now bent inward, their branches entwined as if guarding a secret. The black sap at their roots had spread, forming pools that reflected no light, only eyes, endless, unblinking eyes. The townsfolk, too afraid to gather, whispered of the Devil's Spine, the railway that no longer led to Joplin but to a place no man could name. A new relic was found that morning, half buried in the ice near the tracks. It was a ticket stub, its edges charred, the words, Ironwood Line, 915 October 8th, 1879 barely legible. The name on it, Margaret Poole, was written in ink that shimmered like oil. The finder, a farmer named Amos, dropped it when his fingers began to burn, the skin peeling back to reveal raw flesh. He stumbled to Reverend Hollis, who took the stub with trembling hands. "It's theirs," the preacher said, his voice a hollow echo. "They're marking their own." The ticket was added to the iron box, which now seemed to breathe, its metal warm and slick. Reverend Hollis no longer spoke of God. His prayers were chants, guttural and strange, as if he bargained with something older. "They want us to board," he muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the box. The congregation had dwindled to a handful, those brave or foolish enough to face the church, where shadows moved without light and the air smelled of ash. Ezra Tuttle was no longer a boy but a vessel. His attic was a shrine of carvings, wheels within wheels, faces without mouths, and tracks that spiraled into nothing. Abigail, her hands scarred from trying to stop him, heard him speak in the night, his voice a chorus. "They're waiting. The doors are open." She barred the attic door with iron, but the carvings spread, creeping onto the ceiling, the floor, the windows. The lantern's light followed her now, its glow seeping into her dreams, where she saw a train with cars that stretched into the horizon, its passengers staring with her own face. The telegraph office, abandoned and cold, was visited by a stranger, a man in a black coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He left no name, only a message scratched into the door. "The 915 runs. Do not follow." The townsfolk, hearing of it, whispered of a Pinkerton agent, though none had been sent. The wires, long silent, hummed again, a sound like laughter, low and cruel. The farmer who found the ticket stub, Amos, swore he saw the stranger standing at the tracks that night, his coat fluttering though no wind blew. In the woods the red lights burned brighter, no longer confined to the rails but weaving through the trees like veins. A hunter, lost in the fog, stumbled upon a clearing where the ground was soft, sinking under his weight. He dug, driven by a sound he could not name, and found a bone. Not animal, not human, but something else, carved with symbols that made his eyes bleed. He left it there, fleeing as the ground pulsed beneath him, a heartbeat that matched the hum in the air. Abigail, broken by fear, returned to the tracks, clutching the last of Old Man Carver's charms, a shard of bone wrapped in sinew. The ground took it eagerly, the soil closing over it like a mouth. She felt the hum crawl up her legs, into her chest, and for a moment she saw it. The train, its cars endless, its windows filled with faces that screamed her name. She ran, her breath ragged, and nailed every cross she owned to her walls, though the wood splintered and the nails bent. The storm grew wilder, its lightning a blade that cut the sky, revealing the train's silhouette, twisted, alive, its cars writhing like a serpent. The voices grew louder, no longer whispers but commands. "Board. Ride. Join us." Reverend Hollis, locked in the church, opened the iron box. The watch spun, the locket pulsed, the Bible's pages bled. "I hear you," he whispered, his voice not his own. The ticket stub burned in his hand, its ashes forming words, "You are ours." Bellflower was a shadow of itself, its fields barren, its wells dry, its air a hymn of hunger. The red lights called, the tracks pulsed, and the voices sang, promising passage to a place where time was a wound. The Ironwood 915 was not lost, it was waiting, and its doors were open. What crawls through the veins of the earth, where the roots choke on blood and bone? On the 10th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's ground seemed to shudder, its soil splitting in jagged seams that wept a black, oily sap. The town, now a ghost of itself, lay under a sky that sagged like a rotting shroud, its air thick with a hum that clawed at the mind. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned with a light that was no longer green but red, a pulsing wound that painted the walls with shapes that danced and screamed. The church's iron box, swollen with relics, the watch, locket, Bible, and ticket stub, groaned as if bearing a weight too vast for its frame. The voices were no longer whispers but a chorus, seeping from the earth itself, calling names, reciting fears, promising a journey no soul could return from. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine twisted further, their branches knotted into shapes like hands clasped in agony. The black sap at their roots had spread, forming a path that led to the tracks, where the ice glittered with patterns no frost could form. Wheels, eyes, mouths that gaped without sound. The townsfolk, those who remained, locked themselves away, their prayers drowned by the hum that shook their bones. A new relic was found at dawn, caught in the brambles near the tracks. It was a child's shoe, small and worn, its leather cracked and stained with a substance that smelled of iron and decay. The shoe belonged to Sarah Bell, a girl of 7 who had been on the 915 with her mother, bound for Joplin. The finder, a widow named Ruth, clutched it to her chest, her sobs echoing in the fog. She took it to Reverend Hollis, who stood outside the church, his hands stained with ash. "It's hers," he said, though he had never seen the child. "They're leaving pieces behind." The shoe was placed in the iron box, which now seemed to breathe, its metal pulsing in time with the red light from Abigail's lantern. Reverend Hollis no longer spoke to the townsfolk. His chants filled the church, a language of guttural moans that made the air heavy. "They're here," he whispered to the empty pews, his eyes fixed on the box. The congregation was gone, save for a few who lingered in the shadows, their faces pale, their hands marked with burns like Eliza Crane's. Ezra Tuttle was a stranger in his own skin. The attic was a labyrinth of carvings, trains with mouths, skies with teeth, and tracks that spiraled into a void. Abigail, her hands raw from barring the door, heard him laugh, a sound that was not his, layered with voices that knew her secrets. "The doors are open," he said, his knife carving a face that was hers. She fled, nailing boards across the attic door, but the carving spread, creeping onto the walls of her home, the lines glowing faintly red. The telegraph office, abandoned since Silas Reed vanished, was visited by the stranger in the black coat again. He left no trace, save for a new message scratched into the wall. "The 915 waits. Do not board." The townsfolk whispered of him, calling him a ghost, a demon, or a man who knew too much. The wires, though unplugged, sang with a laughter that was not human, and the air around the office grew cold as if the earth itself recoiled. In the woods, the red lights were no longer lights but eyes, burning through the fog, watching. A hunter, driven mad by the hum, followed them and did not return. His rifle was found the next day, its barrel twisted into a knot, its stock carved with symbols that bled when touched. The children, those few who still spoke, whispered of a train they saw in their dreams, its cars endless, its windows filled with hands that beckoned. Abigail, her mind fraying, dug up the Shawnee charms she had buried near the tracks. The soil clung to them, warm and slick, as if reluctant to let go. She burned them, hoping to break the curse, but the flames turned black, and the smoke formed a train that vanished into the sky. The lantern in her cellar flared, its red light flooding the house, casting shadows that moved with purpose. Figures, tall and thin, their faces blank but their eyes alive. The storm, relentless, tore at the town, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette, now a beast, its cars pulsing like organs, its wheels grinding on tracks of bone. The voices grew louder, no longer a chorus but a command. Board now. Ride forever. Reverend Hollis, locked in the church, opened the iron box. The watch spun wildly, the locket burned through his flesh, the Bible's pages turned to ash, and the shoe, small, broken, seemed to twitch. "I see you," he whispered, his voice a scream. Bellflower was a wound, its fields ash, its wells poison, its air a hymn of despair. The red eyes watched, the tracks pulsed, and the voices called, promising a journey to a place where time was a blade. The Ironwood 915 was not gone, it was here, and its hunger was endless. What sings in the silence between heartbeats, where the air itself holds its breath? On the 11th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's quiet was a living thing, a stillness that pressed against the skin like damp cloth. The town, now a skeleton of its former self, lay under a sky that seemed to sag, its clouds heavy with a weight no storm could carry. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned brighter, its red light now a scream, casting shadows that clawed at the walls with fingers too long for men. The church's iron box, swollen with relics, the watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, and child's shoe, hummed with a rhythm that matched the pulse beneath the earth. The voices were no longer a chorus but a single piercing note, weaving through the town like thread through flesh. They spoke no words, only names: Abigail, Ezra, Hollis, each syllable a hook that pulled at the soul. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer trees but sentinels, their branches twisted into spirals that seemed to turn when no one looked. The black sap had spread, forming a river that flowed toward the tracks, where the ice glittered with shapes. Wheels, hands, faces frozen in mid-scream. A new relic was found at dusk, tangled in the roots of a dying oak. It was a rosary, its beads cracked, its cross bent as if crushed by a fist. The rosary belonged to Mary Bell, mother of Sarah, the child whose shoe had been found. The finder, a farmer's wife named Clara, felt her breath catch when she touched it, her lungs filling with a taste of ash. She brought it to Reverend Hollis, who stood at the church door, his face a mask of bone. "They're leaving offerings," he said, his voice a whisper that carried too far. "They want us to follow." The rosary was added to the iron box, which now seemed to writhe, its metal etched with marks that looked like veins. Reverend Hollis no longer chanted. He sat in the church, staring at the box. His hands burned where he had touched the relics. "They're not dead," he murmured to the empty air. "They're riding still." The few who dared approach the church heard a sound from within, a grinding like wheels on bone that made their blood run cold. Ezra Tuttle was gone, though his body remained. The attic was a cathedral of carvings, trains with eyes, skies with mouths, and tracks that bled. Abigail, her hands scarred and trembling, heard him sing, a hymn that was not a hymn, its notes twisting like smoke. "They're here," he said, his voice a legion, his eyes reflecting a light that burned red. She tried to drag him from the attic, but his touch was fire, and the carvings moved, crawling across the walls like insects. She fled, barring the door with every nail she had, though the house shook with the hum of the earth. The telegraph office, sealed since Silas Reed's disappearance, was visited again by the stranger in the black coat. He left no words this time, only a mark, a spiral carved into the doorframe, its edges wet with sap. The townsfolk, those few who saw it, whispered of a warning, though none dared read it aloud. The wires, long dead, sang with a sound like laughter, sharp and cruel, and the air around the office grew heavy, as if the earth held its breath. In the woods, the red eyes were no longer distant but close, burning through the fog like stars fallen to earth. A boy sent to fetch wood saw a figure by the tracks, tall, its limbs bent backward, its face a void. He ran, his scream swallowed by the hum, and told his mother of hands that reached from the ground. She found no hands, but the soil was warm, and the tracks bore prints that were neither boot nor hoof, leading into the dark. Abigail, her mind a frayed thread, burned the last of Old Man Carver's charms, though the flames turned black and the smoke formed a face that was not hers. The lantern in her cellar pulsed, its red light flooding the house, casting shadows that walked on their own, figures with no faces, their hands outstretched. She nailed crosses to every window, but the wood split, and the nails bled a substance that was not rust. The storm, unyielding, tore at the sky, its lightning revealing the train silhouette, now a leviathan, its cars pulsing like a heart, its wheels grinding on tracks of flesh. The voices were a command: board, ride, become. Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, opened the iron box. The watch spun, its hands a blur. The locket burned through his skin. The Bible bled ink. The ticket stub crumbled to ash. And the rosary, its beads alive, wrapped around his wrist like a chain. "I am yours," he whispered, his voice a scream that was not his. Bellflower was a grave, its fields ash, its wells poison, its air a song of despair. The red eyes burned, the tracks pulsed, and the voices called, promising a journey to a place where time was a wound and the soul was a price. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was here, and its doors were wide. What grows eyes in the dark, where the shadows watch with a hunger no light can sate. On the 12th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's darkness was a living thing, its weight pressing into the lungs, stealing breath. The town, now a husk teetering on the edge of oblivion, lay beneath a sky that seemed to bleed, its clouds streaked with veins of red. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned with a light that was no longer red, but black, a void that swallowed the walls, casting shapes that whispered names. The church's iron box, swollen with relics, the watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, shoe, and rosary, throbbed like a heart, its metal etched with symbols that moved when no one looked. The voices were no longer a command but a pulse, beating through the earth, the air, the bones of those who remained. They sang no words, only a sound, a low, grinding moan that carried the weight of 1,000 screams. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer trees but bones, their branches twisted into cages that trapped the wind. The black sap had formed a lake, its surface rippling with faces that flickered and vanished. The tracks coated in ice that burned to the touch bore marks, claw scratches too deep for any beast, leading into the fog. A new relic was found at midnight, caught in the thorns of a briar patch near the tracks. It was a letter, sealed with wax, its paper brittle and stained with a substance that smelled of blood. The letter, addressed to no one, was written in Thomas Greer's hand, the conductor of the 9:15. Its words were a fevered scrawl. The train does not stop. The doors do not close. We are not alone. The finder, a boy named Isaac, felt his skin crawl as he read it, his eyes stinging as if pricked by needles. He took it to Reverend Hollis, who stood in the churchyard, his hands bleeding where the rosary had cut him. "They write to us," the preacher said, his voice a hollow echo. "They beg us to come." The letter was placed in the iron box, which now seemed to breathe, its lid trembling as if straining to open. Reverend Hollis no longer spoke to the living. He knelt before the box, his chants a guttural hymn that made the air taste of ash. "They are not dead," he whispered to the shadows. "They are forever." The church was empty, its pews coated in frost that formed patterns, wheels, eyes, hands that reached. Those who passed by heard a sound from within, a grinding like iron on bone that made their hearts stutter. Ezra Tuttle was no longer human. His attic was a wound, its walls bleeding with carvings, trains with veins, skies with claws, and tracks that spiraled into a maw. Abigail, her mind unraveling, heard him laugh, a sound that was not laughter but a chorus of the damned. "They're home," he said, his voice 1,000 voices, his hands carving her name into the floor. She tried to burn the attic, but the flames turned black, and the smoke formed a train that coiled around her. She fled, nailing the door shut with iron, but the house shook, the lantern's black light flooding every room. The telegraph office, abandoned and cold, was visited again by the stranger in the black coat. He left no mark this time, only a silence that was louder than the hum. The wires, though dead, sang with a sound like weeping, and the air around the office grew thick, as if the earth itself mourned. A farmer, searching for Silas Reed, found only the logbook, its pages now blank save for a single word, written in blood: bored. In the woods, the red eyes were no longer eyes but mouths, gaping through the fog, singing a song that promised oblivion. A girl, lost in the dark, saw a figure by the tracks, tall, its limbs stretched thin, its face a mirror of her own. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed, and her mother found only her shawl, torn and warm, lying on the ice. The tracks bore new marks, handprints burned into the iron, their fingers too many, too long. Abigail, her soul fraying, burned the last of her crosses, though the flames turned to ash before they caught. The lantern's black light followed her, casting shadows that walked with her, their hands brushing her skin. She buried a knife in the cellar, hoping to kill the light, but the ground spat it back, the blade etched with her name. The hum was louder now, a scream that lived in her bones, and she saw it. The train, its cars endless, its windows filled with faces that were hers. The storm, relentless, tore the sky apart, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette, now a god, its cars pulsing like flesh, its wheels grinding on tracks of blood. The voices were a promise: board, ride, be ours. Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, opened the iron box. The watch spun into nothing, the locket burned his bones, the Bible bled rivers, the ticket stub crumbled, the shoe twitched, the rosary bound him, and the letter, its words alive, spoke his name. "I am ready," he whispered, his voice a wound. Bellflower was a void, its fields dust, its wells poison, its air a hymn of hunger. The red mouths sang, the tracks bled, and the shadows reached, calling for those who listened. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was here, and its hunger was eternal. What weeps from the stars when the sky forgets its light, dripping sorrow that burns the skin. On the 13th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's heavens seemed to mourn, their clouds weeping a black rain that stung like nettles. The town, now a scar upon the earth, lay silent under a darkness that pulsed with intent, its air thick with a hum that gnawed at the soul. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned with a light that was no longer black, but alive, a writhing void that cast shadows with teeth and eyes. The church's iron box, swollen with relics, the watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, shoe, rosary, and letter, throbbed like a wound, its metal cracking under a weight no forge could bear. The voices were no longer a pulse but a scream, tearing through the town like a blade through flesh. They spoke no names now, only a command, "Come," that hooked into the heart and pulled. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer sentinels but altars, their branches woven into crowns that bled sap onto the tracks. The black lake at their roots had grown, its surface a mirror that showed not the sky but faces, Thomas Greer, Margaret Poole, Sarah Bell, twisted and wrong, their mouths moving in silent pleas. A new relic was found at dawn, caught in the ice near the tracks. It was a whistle, the kind a conductor might carry, its metal warped and warm, etched with scratches that formed no words but seemed to scream. It belonged to Thomas Greer, or so the townsfolk whispered, though none could say how they knew. The finder, a widow named Martha, felt her breath stop when she touched it, her lungs filling with a taste of ash and iron. She took it to Reverend Hollis, who stood in the churchyard, his hands bound in rags where the rosary had cut him. "They're calling us home," he said, his voice a splintered thing. "The train is ready." The whistle was added to the iron box, which now seemed to sing, its relics pulsing in time with the hum beneath the earth. Reverend Hollis no longer knelt. He stood before the box, his eyes reflecting a light that was not his chants a hymn of surrender. "They are not lost," he whispered to the shadows. "They are us." The church was a tomb, its walls coated in frost that formed spirals, wheels, hands that clawed at the air. Those who passed heard a sound, grinding, shrieking like iron on flesh, that made their bones ache. Ezra Tuttle was no longer a boy but a door. His attic was a shrine of madness, its carvings alive, trains with hearts, skies with veins, tracks that bled into a void. Abigail, her hands bleeding from failed prayers, heard him speak, his voice a legion. "The doors are wide. They wait." She tried to burn the house, but the flames died, swallowed by the lantern's void. The carving spread, crawling onto her skin, lines that glowed red and whispered her name. She barred every door, but the house was no longer hers. It belonged to the hum. The telegraph office, a ruin since Silas Reed vanished, was visited once more by the stranger in the black coat. He left no trace, only a silence that screamed louder than the wires. The door's spiral mark had deepened, its edges wet with blood that was not blood. A farmer seeking answers found only the office's walls, now scratched with words. "The 915 is here. Do not look." The wires, dead and coiled, sang with a sound like sobbing, and the air grew heavy, as if the earth itself wept. In the woods, the red mouths were no longer mouths but doors, gaping through the fog, promising a journey no soul could survive. A hunter, driven by the hum, followed them and returned changed, his eyes blind, his hands marked with burns. He spoke of a train, its cars endless, its windows filled with faces that were his own. His wife found his boots by the tracks, filled with black sap, their soles etched with symbols that moved when she blinked. Abigail, her mind a shattered thing, dug up the earth where she had buried Carver's charms, but the soil was alive, warm and pulsing, refusing her touch. She screamed, her voice lost in the hum, and saw it. The train, its cars a serpent, its windows alive with eyes that knew her. The lantern's void followed her, casting shadows that walked beside her, their hands cold and sharp. She nailed her last cross to the door, but the wood bled, and the nails turned to ash. The storm, unending, tore at the sky, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette, now a god, its cars breathing, its wheels grinding on tracks of bone and blood. The voices were a vow: board, ride, be one. Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, opened the iron box. The watch melted, the locket burned his soul. The Bible screamed, the ticket stub bled, the shoe danced, the rosary bound him, the letter spoke, and the whistle, its note a wail, called his name. "I am theirs," he whispered, his voice a wound that bled light. Bellflower was a wound, its fields ash, its wells poison, its air a scream of hunger. The red doors beckoned, the tracks sang, and the shadows reached, calling for those who dared answer. The Ironwood 915 was not gone, it was here, and its hunger was eternal. What stitches the night together when the stars unravel, sewing shadows into a shroud that chokes? On the 14th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's darkness was a tapestry of dread, its threads woven from screams no throat could form. The town, now a ghost clinging to the earth's edge, lay beneath a sky that bled black, its clouds pulsing like a heart too vast to fathom. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar burned with a light that was no longer a void, but a presence, a writhing thing that cast shadows with claws and tongues. The church's iron box, swollen with relics, the watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, shoe, rosary, letter, and whistle, sang with a voice that shook the earth, its metal splitting to reveal a light that was not light but hunger. The voices were no longer a scream but a hymn, a melody that clawed at the soul, pulling it toward the tracks. They spoke no words, only a call, "Come now," that burned in the blood like fever. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer altars but mouths, their branches gaping wide, their sap a river that flowed into the tracks. The black lake at their roots had spread, its surface a mirror of eyes that watched unblinking, their gazes carving names into the hearts of those who remained. A new relic was found at dusk, tangled in the ice that coated the tracks. It was a hairpin, silver and bent, its tip stained with a substance that smelled of ash and bone. It belonged to Margaret Poole, the school teacher, or so the whispers said, though none could recall her wearing it. The finder, a girl named Hannah, felt her skin burn where she touched it, her fingers marked with a spiral that wept black. She took it to Reverend Hollis, who stood in the churchyard, his body trembling, his eyes reflecting a light that was not his. "They leave gifts," he said, his voice a wound. "They want us to join." The hairpin was added to the iron box, which now seemed to breathe, its cracks glowing with a light that pulsed in time with the hum beneath the earth. Reverend Hollis no longer stood. He knelt before the box, his body marked with burns, his chants a wail that made the air bleed. "They are us," he whispered to the dark. "We are them." The church was a grave, its walls weeping frost that formed faces. Thomas Greer, Sarah Bell, others, their mouths open in silent screams. Ezra Tuttle was no longer a vessel but a gate. His attic was a void, its carvings alive, trains with lungs, skies with teeth, tracks that bled into eternity. Abigail, her soul unraveling, heard him sing, a hymn that was not his, its notes a chorus of the lost. "The train is here," he said, his voice a thousand throats, his hands carving her face into the walls. She tried to burn the house, but the flames were swallowed by the lantern's presence, the smoke forming a train that coiled around her heart. She nailed the attic shut, but the carvings spread, crawling onto her skin, their lines alive with red light. The telegraph office, a ruin since Silas Reed vanished, was visited again by the stranger in the black coat. He left no mark, only a silence that screamed louder than the hum. The spiral on the door had deepened, its edges bleeding a substance that was not blood. A boy seeking his father found only the walls, now etched with words. The 9:15 is now. Do not see. The wires, though dead, sang with a sound like laughter, sharp and endless, and the air grew thick, as if the earth itself wept tears of ash. In the woods, the red doors were no longer doors but throats, gaping through the fog, singing a song that promised oblivion. A farmer, lost in the dark, saw a figure by the tracks, tall, its limbs twisted, its face a mirror of his own. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed, and his wife found only his hat, warm and wet, lying on the ice. The tracks bore new marks, footprints, burned into the iron, their toes too many, their shape too wrong. Abigail, her mind a broken thing, dug into the earth where the tracks met the woods, seeking the charms she had buried. The soil was alive, pulsing and warm, and it took her hands, pulling until she tore free, her fingers bleeding black. The lantern's presence followed her, casting shadows that spoke her name, their claws brushing her soul. She burned her last prayers, but the flames turned to ash, and the smoke formed a face that was hers. The storm, eternal, tore at the sky, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette. Now a leviathan, its cars breathing, its wheels grinding on tracks of flesh and bone. The voices were a vow. Board, ride, be whole. Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, opened the iron box. The watch was dust, the locket aflame, the Bible a scream, the ticket stub ash, the shoe alive, the rosary a chain, the letter a voice, the whistle a wail, and the hairpin, its tip alive, pierced his heart. I am home, he whispered, his voice a wound that bled light. Bellflower was a void, its fields dust, its wells poison, its air a hymn of despair. The red throats sang, the tracks bled, and the shadows reached, calling for those who dared answer. The ironwood 9:15 was not gone. It was here, and its doors were eternal. What bleeds from the earth when the ground forgets its own name, spilling secrets no man should know? On the 15th night after the ironwood 9:15 vanished, Bellflower's soil was a wound, its cracks weeping a black ichor that burned the grass to ash. The town, now a shadow etched in despair, lay beneath a sky that pulsed with a sickly light, its clouds writhing like a beast in pain. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar was no longer a lantern but a heart, its light a throbbing void that cast shadows with voices whispering sins no soul could bear. The church's iron box, swollen with relics, the watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, shoe, rosary, letter, whistle, and hairpin, screamed with a sound that split the air, its metal fracturing into shards that bled. The voices were no longer a hymn but a roar, a cacophony that tore through the town like a flood, drowning thought, drowning will. They spoke no words, only a demand. Come now, be ours, that clawed at the mind until it broke. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer mouths but eyes, their branches blinking, their sap a tide that flowed into the tracks, where the ice had melted into a river of black, its surface alive with hands that reached and grasped. The townsfolk, those few who remained, were ghosts in their own homes, their eyes hollow, their skin marked with spirals that wept. A new relic was found at midnight, caught in the roots of an oak that seemed to scream. It was a pocket knife, its blade rusted but sharp, its handle carved with the initials S.B., Sarah Bell, the child lost with her mother. The finder, a boy named Daniel, felt his blood turn cold when he touched it, his fingers trembling as if the knife knew him. He took it to Reverend Hollis, who stood in the churchyard, his body a ruin, his hands bleeding where the relics had marked him. They leave their tools, the preacher said, his voice a wound that bled light. They carve their way. The pocket knife was added to the iron box, which now seemed to writhe, its shards pulsing with a light that was not light but hunger. Reverend Hollis no longer knelt. He stood before the box, his body trembling, his chants a scream that made the air bleed ash. We are theirs, he whispered to the dark, his eyes reflecting a void that swallowed hope. The church was a wound, its walls crumbling, its frost forming faces that spoke. Thomas Greer, Margaret Poole, Mary Bell, their voices a chorus of despair. Ezra Tuttle was no longer a gate but a bridge. His attic was a void, its carvings alive, trains with souls, skies with claws, tracks that bled into a maw that hungered. Abigail, her mind a shattered mirror, heard him laugh, a sound that was not laughter but a legion of the lost. "The train is home," he said, his voice a thousand screams, his hands carving her name into the air. She tried to burn the house, but the flames were swallowed by the lantern's heart, the smoke forming a train that wrapped around her soul. She nailed the walls shut, but the carvings spread, crawling into her dreams, their lines alive with blood. The telegraph office, a ruin since Silas Reed vanished, was visited again by the stranger in the black coat. He left no trace, only a silence that screamed louder than the roar. The spiral on the door had become a mouth, its edges bleeding a substance that was not blood but something older. A woman, seeking her husband, found only the walls, now etched with words. "The 9:15 is all. Do not look back." The wires, dead and twisted, sang with a sound like weeping, endless and cold, and the air grew thick, as if the earth itself mourned its own death. In the woods, the red throats were no longer throats but gates, gaping through the fog, promising a journey no soul could return from. A hunter, driven by the roar, followed them and did not return. His wife found only his coat, warm and wet, lying on the tracks, its fabric etched with symbols that moved like worms. The tracks bore new marks, claw marks, burned into the iron, their edges alive with a light that was not light, but hunger. Abigail, her soul a frayed thread, dug into the earth where the tracks met the void, seeking anything to end the roar. The soil was alive, pulsing and hot, and it took her hands, pulling until she screamed, her blood mixing with the black ichor. The lantern's heart followed her, casting shadows that sang her name, their claws tearing at her soul. She burned her last prayers, but the flames turned to ash, and the smoke formed a face that was hers, twisted and wrong. The storm, eternal, tore the sky apart, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette. Now a god, its cars breathing, its wheels grinding on tracks of flesh and bone. The voices were a vow, board, ride, be one. Reverend Hollis, alone in the church, opened the iron box. The watch was ash, the locket a flame, the Bible a scream, the ticket stub dust, the shoe alive, the rosary a chain, the letter a voice, the whistle a wail, the hairpin a blade, and the pocket knife, its edge alive, cut his soul. "I am theirs," he screamed, his voice a wound that bled eternity. Bellflower was a void, its fields ash, its wells poison, its air a roar of despair. The red gates beckoned, the tracks bled, and the shadows sang, calling for those who could not resist. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was here, and its hunger was all. What claws at the edges of dreams, where the mind unravels into a tapestry of screams. On the 16th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower's sleep was a grave, its dreams a labyrinth of horrors that bled into waking. The town, now a wound carved into the earth, lay beneath a sky that pulsed with a light that was not light but a hunger, its clouds writhing like veins in a dying beast. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar was no longer a heart, but a god, its void a maw that cast shadows with teeth that spoke her sins. The church's iron box, shattered by its relics, the watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, shoe, rosary, letter, whistle, hairpin, and pocket knife, sang with a voice that tore the air, its shards scattered across the altar, each bleeding a light that burned. The voices were no longer a roar but a silence, a void that swallowed thought and soul, pulling all toward the tracks. They spoke no words, only a pull. "Come now, be whole," that hooked into the blood and tore. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer eyes but throats, their branches gaping, their sap a flood that drowned the tracks in black. The ice had vanished, replaced by a river of ichor that pulsed with faces. Thomas Greer, Margaret Poole, Sarah Bell, Mary Bell, twisted into shapes that screamed without sound. A new relic was found at dawn, caught in the black river's current. It was a ribbon, red and frayed, its threads woven with a pattern that seemed to move, like eyes blinking in the dark. It belonged to Mary Bell, mother of Sarah, or so the whispers claimed, though none could say how they knew. The finder, a boy named Samuel, felt his heart stutter when he touched it, his breath tasting of ash and blood. He took it to Reverend Hollis, who stood in the churchyard, his body a ruin, his skin etched with spirals that wept. "They weave their chains," the preacher said, his voice a wound that bled light. "They bind us." The ribbon was added to the scattered relics, which now seemed to live, their shards pulsing with a light that was not light but a call. Reverend Hollis no longer stood. He knelt among the shards, his body bleeding, his screams a hymn that made the air weep ash. "We are theirs," he whispered to the void, his eyes a mirror of the tracks. The church was a ruin, its walls crumbling, its frost-forming hands that clawed at the air, their fingers too many, too long. Ezra Tuttle was no longer a bridge, but a maw. His attic was a void, its carvings alive, trains with bones, skies with tongues, tracks that bled into a throat that hungered. Abigail, her soul a shattered thing, heard him sing, a hymn that was not his, its notes a legion of the damned. "The train is all," he said, his voice a thousand wounds, his hands carving her name into the air. She tried to burn the house, but the flames were swallowed by the lantern's god, the smoke forming a train that coiled around her heart. She nailed the walls shut, but the carvings spread, crawling onto her soul, their lines alive with blood. The telegraph office, a husk since Silas Reed vanished, was visited again by the stranger in the black coat. He left no trace, only a silence that screamed louder than the void. The spiral on the door had become a throat, its edges bleeding a substance that was not blood, but something older. A woman, seeking her child, found only the walls, now etched with words. "The 915 is forever. Do not turn." The wires, dead and coiled, sang with a sound like laughter, cold and endless, and the air grew thick, as if the earth itself mourned its own end. In the woods, the red gates were no longer gates but voids gaping through the fog, promising a journey no soul could escape. A hunter, driven by the silence, followed them and did not return. His wife found only his knife, warm and wet, lying on the tracks, its blade etched with symbols that moved like veins. The tracks bore new marks, handprints, burned into the iron, their fingers alive, their shape a scream. Abigail, her mind a broken thread, dug into the earth where the tracks met the void, seeking anything to end the pull. The soil was alive, hot and pulsing, and it took her hands, pulling until she tore free, her blood mixing with the black river. The lantern's god followed her, casting shadows that sang her name, their teeth tearing at her soul. She burned her last prayers, but the flames turned to ash, and the smoke formed a face that was hers, twisted into a scream. The storm, eternal, tore the sky apart, its lightning revealing the train's silhouette, now a leviathan, its cars breathing, its wheels grinding on tracks of flesh and bone. The silence was a vow: board, ride, be one. Reverend Hollis, alone among the shards, touched the relics. The watch was dust, the locket aflame, the Bible a scream, the ticket stub ash, the shoe alive, the rosary a chain, the letter a voice, the whistle a wail, the hairpin a blade, the pocket knife a cut, and the ribbon, its threads alive, bound his soul. "I am home," he screamed, his voice a wound that bled eternity. Bellflower was a void, its fields ash, its wells poison, its air a silence of despair. The red voids beckoned, the tracks bled, and the shadows sang, calling for those who could not resist. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was here, and its hunger was all. What waits beyond the edge of knowing, where the void hums with a hunger that names you? On the 17th night after the Ironwood 915 vanished, Bellflower was no longer a town, but a wound, its existence a scar swallowed by a darkness that breathed. The sky was gone, replaced by a pulsing black that wept light like blood, its weight crushing the earth below. The lantern in Abigail Tuttle's cellar was no longer a god but a mouth, its void a scream that cast shadows with eyes that knew all sins. The church's iron box was shattered, its relics, watch, locket, Bible, ticket stub, shoe, rosary, letter, whistle, hairpin, pocket knife, ribbon, scattered across the altar, each pulsing with a life that was not life but a call to oblivion. The silence was no longer a vow but a presence, a force that clawed through the soul, pulling all toward the tracks. It spoke no words, only a pull. Come now, be nothing, that burned in the blood and broke the mind. The scarred oaks along the devil's spine were no longer throats but gates, their branches open, their sap a sea that drowned the tracks in black. The river of ichor was alive, its surface a tapestry of faces. Thomas Greer, Margaret Poole, Sarah Bell, Mary Bell, and others, twisted into shapes that screamed forever, their eyes watching, waiting. No new relic was found, for none were needed. The tracks themselves were relics, their iron pulsing with a heat that was not heat but hunger. The townsfolk, those few who remained, were shadows, their bodies marked with spirals that bled, their eyes reflecting a void that was not theirs. Abigail Tuttle, her soul a frayed thread, stood at the track's edge, the lantern's mouth behind her, its shadows whispering her name. She had burned her crosses, her prayers, her charms, but the flames were ash, and the smoke was a train that coiled around her heart. Reverend Hollis was no longer a man but a wound. The church was a void, its walls dust, its altar a throne of relics that sang. He knelt among them, his body bleeding light, his screams a hymn that tore the air. "We are home," he whispered, his voice a legion, his eyes mirrors of the tracks. The relics, watch to dust, locket to flame, Bible to scream, ticket stub to ash, shoe to life, rosary to chain, letter to voice, whistle to wail, hairpin to blade, pocket knife to cut, ribbon to bind, were no longer objects but doors, each opening to a place where time was a blade and the soul was a price. Ezra Tuttle was no longer a gate, but a train. His attic was gone, the house a void, its carvings alive. Trains with souls, skies with teeth, tracks that bled into eternity. Abigail heard him laugh, a sound that was not his but a chorus of the damned, echoing from the tracks. "The doors are open," he said, his voice a thousand wounds, his hands carving the air into her name. She tried to flee, but the lantern's mouth followed, its shadows clawing at her soul, their teeth singing her sins. The telegraph office was dust, its wires a web of laughter that was not laughter but despair. The stranger in the black coat was gone, or perhaps he had never been, his spiral a throat that swallowed the town. The walls, now ash, bore no words, only a hum that was the train, endless and alive. The woods were no longer woods but a labyrinth, the red voids now a sky of mouths, gaping through the fog, promising a journey no soul could return from. A child, lost in the dark, saw a figure by the tracks, tall, its limbs endless, its face a void that was hers. She did not scream, for the silence took her, and her mother found only her shadow, burned into the earth. Abigail stood at the tracks, the lantern's mouth at her back, the hum in her bones. The soil was alive, pulsing with faces that knew her, hands that reached for her. She saw it, the train, its cars endless, its windows alive with eyes that were hers, its wheels grinding on tracks of bone and blood. The silence was a vow. Board, ride, be one. She stepped forward, her foot touching the iron, and the ground opened, its ichor swallowing her scream. The lantern's mouth closed, the shadows sang, and the tracks pulsed, claiming her name. Reverend Hollis, among the relics, was no longer there. The church was gone, the altar a void, the relics a choir that sang of eternity. The voices were all, the tracks were all, the train was all. Bellflower was no longer a place but a question, unanswered, unanswerable. The red mouths beckoned, the tracks bled, and the shadows danced, calling for those who were already theirs. The Ironwood 915 was not gone. It was here, and its doors were open, forever. And yet in the silence, a hum lingered. A lantern burned somewhere, warm to the touch. A watch ticked backward, a ribbon wove itself anew. The tracks stretched on, and the train, unseen, unheard, but felt, waited. For whom? No one could say. The Bellflower train killings were not solved, not ended, but alive, a wound that would not close, a hunger that would not sleep. As the wind howls through the hollows of Bellflower, carrying whispers no soul should hear, the tracks lie silent, yet they wait. The Ironwood 915 is gone, but its shadow lingers, a hunger that knows your name. Here, at Sanctified Secrets, we uncover the truths buried in the earth's dark veins, the mysteries that breathe in the spaces between light and shadow. Subscribe if you dare to walk these haunted paths with us. Share our tales with those who listen to the night, and heed this warning. When the lantern burns warm, when the tracks hum low, do not follow. Until the next secret unveils itself, stay watchful, for the dark is never far.